Welcome everyone to our session today. My name is Anissa and I am a CLS Indonesia alumna and a Fulbright research grantee to Malaysia just 2 years ago in 2019. So currently I'm a research and advocacy manager at Stewardship Asia Center here in Singapore. So I'm currently in Singapore right now. So forgive me if my voice hasn't woken up yet. It's still quite early in the morning. But regardless, I'm so grateful to be here and have the opportunity to hear from others with similar, even quite different experiences to mine of being abroad. So I'll be your moderator for today and will help guide some of the discussion as the conversation continues to flow. So we hope you've enjoyed hearing from all of our amazing speakers over the last 2 days. For this session today, we'll be delving deeper into kind of the good, the bad, and the ugly, exactly what the title kind of gives us a picture of study abroad, but particularly highlighting the unique experiences that someone who identifies as Black, Indigenous, or a person of color can experience. So as many of you in the audience already know, the BIPOC experience is not a monolithic one. And so depending on how you present yourself, in addition to other identities you may hold, it's quite assuring to have resources or tools beforehand to keep in mind. So the purpose of this session is truly to do that and to give you a chance to hear from amazing panelists on how they've navigated their own identity as BIPOC abroad. So welcome and thank you for joining the session again. So before I hand it off to our panelists to introduce themselves, a few housekeeping notes. So a recorded session of this webinar won't be available. So everything here, as you see, is kind of live, but we will have a Q&A session near the end of the panel. So please feel free to leave questions in the Q&A box below throughout the panel so that we can also answer any questions as they can arise. So, and by the way, we encourage you to share your thoughts and experiences on Facebook, Instagram, Twitter, LinkedIn, whichever one that you're more comfortable using. And our hashtag is @WeRepresent2021. So we really want to hear from you. So now I'll hand it off to our panelists so that they can introduce themselves a little bit. Amber, could you start us off?
Yes, hi Anissa, and thanks for having me and to represent for hosting this whole session, this entire thing. This conference has been great. And hello to our participants. My name is Amber Demery. I am currently a national security analyst at the U.S. Department of Justice in Washington, D.C. I currently work on counterterrorism, Middle East matters for the most part, but prior to coming to this job, I was a grad student and I did a Boren Fellowship to Japan. So I'm sure you guys all know about Boren by now at the end of this conference. But I was living in Japan with with Boren funding for about 10 months back in 2014 to 2015, a long time ago. But before that, I had also been like studying Japanese and Japanese culture and everything like that. So in addition to what I do for work, outside of this, I'm also a member of Women of Color Advancing Peace and Security. And I'm a Pacific Forum Young Leader where I focus on more East Asia and Indo-Pacific matters. So that'll be all for me. Russel?
Hi, everyone. Thanks so much for joining. I'm Russel Altamirano, sorry. And I am currently in Vienna, my host city, where I completed my Fulbright program year in the academic year 2019 through 2020. So right up until the start of the pandemic. But I'm also a former Gilman recipient when I was in college, so back in fall 2014. So I'm really excited to be a part of this panel to share a little bit, I'll do my best to bring in experiences from both my Gilman scholarship time, right, while I was in university, but also, a few years after graduating university as a Fulbright scholar as well. I'm currently still in Vienna because I extended the teaching component of my Fulbright grant. So I'm a second year teaching assistant, English teaching assistant, actually also Spanish, which is I can get into later. So yeah, and in university, I studied art history. So I have a background in art history, museum education, and now really gearing my career more toward formal education toward becoming a formal classroom teacher. So Thanks, everyone.
Great. Thanks, Russel. Rohan.
Hi, everyone. My name is Rohan Dharan. Currently, I work for DC Public Schools, so I'm also usually based in Washington, DC. I'm the manager for AP classes for the district, and I've worked for DCPS for about 4.5 years. And then immediately before I started at DCPS, I completed a Fulbright English teaching assistantship in New Delhi, India. So that was 2015 to 2016. I worked as a spoken English teacher in a government aided school in New Delhi and worked with kids in grades 5th through 9th, teaching spoken English. I also got a chance to direct a play and really get involved in my school community while I was there. Before Fulbright, I was a Teach for America core member in Las Vegas and taught elementary school for 2 years. And I'm actually currently in India. I have been for most of the pandemic. My wife is here actually. And so unlike Anissa, I did the opposite way. I stayed up late instead of waking up early. So bear with me if I start yawning a little bit.
Great. Thank you so much, everyone, for just giving us kind of a picture of where you are in the world, especially. Rohan, I definitely sympathize with you. I stayed up yesterday as well. So first, I kind of want to delve into the broader picture. So how did being, for everyone to kind of chip in on this, so how did being Black, Indigenous, or a person of color affect how people perceived you during your study abroad, during Gilman, or whether it be Fulbright or Boren? So can I ask one of you to start us off? Maybe Russel, if you want to start us off.
Sure. So yeah, I think that, again, I'm sort of going to dip into, while being brief, 2 experiences. So while I did my Gilman scholarship in Berlin, Germany, in 2014, and that was my first semester as my first semester as a third year in university. And at the time, I think that was my absolute first time going abroad, really leaving the US. That didn't include Mexico when I was visiting the very small town where my family lives. So it was really my first international trip. I'm from Southern California as well. So I've grown up in a bubble of like Chicano culture, of Mexican American communities and neighborhoods. And so all around me, I really just saw people who I can identify with and relate with, really growing up with, and even at my university, UC Riverside in Southern California, which is an incredibly diverse university. So I was really terrified of going abroad for the first time, for the reason of sort of, for one of the first times in my life, really stepping outside of this bubble of mine. And so with my time in Berlin, so Berlin is an incredibly diverse city. And the fact that it's also a metropolitan city didn't feel, didn't give me as much of a culture shock as I would have expected. But it wasn't until I did my Fulbright year in Austria and I started visiting much like the smaller towns in the Alps that were sort of away from, these mass tourist spots, that I would start really feeling my presence as being the only brown person in the room. I never felt sort of in any way, like in harm's way, I guess you can say. But I did, once I started sort of stepping out of like a metropolitan area, that's when I started feeling, and I'll talk about that a little bit more later.
Okay, thanks, Russel. I think that's also an important perspective to kind of get. I'm sure going from California to Europe was very drastically different as well. But so can I hear from Rohan or Amber to see how being BIPOC, like how it affected how people perceived you and kind of your host country?
Sure, I can jump in. So I guess, my experience is a little bit different, but also fairly common in the world of Fulbright scholars. So I identify as Indian American. My parents are immigrants from India. So obviously coming and doing a Fulbright in India, I didn't necessarily stick out the same way that someone who's not of the race of that country might. But I was it's still an interesting position because you're there, like obviously as an American through an American program, and most of my like community, or at least immediate community when I got here, was other Fulbrighters who were majority white. So my experience, it kind of varied by situation. So like if I was just walking around by myself on the street, there's not much that would give me away as somebody who's not from India. And so that, I mean, not to say that it can't happen based on how you dress, how you present yourself. Once you start talking, like there are things that can give you away, even if your race is the same as the country. But I think I had the most kind of challenging, or I guess unexpected experiences when I was with some of my other colleagues, and just seeing like how my reception was different. Not always bad, but different. On the bad side, like there were a couple times where like people assumed I was the guide of the group, or things like that, where they just wouldn't assume that I was one of the Americans who were part of that group. And that kind of really came to, I hit my climax with that at the end of my Fulbright trip, or sorry, my Fulbright year. My good friend, who's a white man, visited me, and we traveled around more like rural parts of India. Like I said, I was in New Delhi, which again, being in a city is always a little bit different. And I mean, I've traveled India, I have family in India, I've visited throughout my whole life, but I had never like, spent that much time with a white person in India, and just like seeing the amount of attention he would get, and the staring and the pictures and all these things, like I started getting like angry on behalf of my fellow Indians about like the way that he was treated. But again, like oftentimes it was assumed that I was either his guide, or even when I got upset, they would think that like, oh, are you upset because you didn't get the picture taken of you? Like it wasn't something that necessarily made sense. So yeah, I mean, I'll leave it at that. But like I said, it's an experience that, like, obviously, like coming from America, there's a wide range of folks who end up doing Fulbrights, and so your experience can be similar to mine, where you may actually be seen as a local based on where you are.
Yeah, and I think that's a very unique experiences for people that have roots to that country will also face. I think I faced similar and very different experiences in Indonesia as well, doing a CLS in Indonesia, when my fellow white participants would basically, it's the photos, it's the staring, it's that different, it's a very huge dichotomy than your own kind of experience that you never had. So I could definitely relate. So Amber, can you just give us kind of a different perspective as well? So you were in Japan doing your born, right?
Yeah, in Japan. Actually, I'm gonna go a little bit the route that Russel went as well. So I came from a pretty diverse high school. It was a magnet high school in Louisiana. And then I went to Howard, which is more like diverse within the Black and Brown communities. And then for grad school, I did international relations. So we had people from all over the world in our program. So it's been kind of a trajectory of diversity throughout my academic career. And so the first time I actually went to Japan was in undergrad. So I didn't, going there again was not a shock or anything for me in grad school. But I will definitely say that I had similar experiences, like the ones previously mentioned, about when going to the countryside versus the city versus Tokyo. Tokyo is a pretty diverse, large metropolitan area. And even though they don't have a lot of non-Japanese or non-Asian people there often, well, all the time, it does happen. Like they see a wide variety of people. Going to like some of the countryside areas was much more interesting. It was interesting in a different way though, because some people would be like, they'd never seen a Black person, but they maybe haven't also never seen a white person. So we'd get pictures taken of both of us, like me and like a friend from the Netherlands, right? It'd be such an interesting experience from both sides. I think I don't know if necessarily it how they perceived me, like how it did, if that really was a large thing. Well, I have a few stories that we'll talk about later, but that was a huge thing initially. But one thing I did want to bring up here was a comment that a friend of mine made when we had first been in Japan for a little while. And he was a white guy from New York. And he mentioned like this is the first time he'd ever felt like a minority. And I was like, wow, I feel like that all the time in America. So in a way, I kind of felt like our experience as BIPOC kind of prepares us a little bit more for these overseas experiences where you are a minority. like it's not so much of a shock to not see so many people who look like you, because it can happen almost every day here.
Yeah. Well, actually, we'd love to hear these stories. Like, what are some things that surprised or challenged you? Like, what are some of these things that you faced that kind of also changed your perception?
Yeah, so there were a few times where like things happen. Like I remember one time in particular. Well, I'll say two things actually. So one time when I was on a train actually in Tokyo going from my host family to my my school at the time, and this has only ever happened to me once in Japan, which is actually kind of surprising, where I sat down next to an older woman and she got up and moved, an older Japanese lady. But the interesting thing is, like, her husband, an older Japanese man, was right next to her, and he looked at her like, "What are you doing?" Very confused. So I just kind of, shrugged it off. It wasn't a big deal to me. But another interesting kind of scenario on the other side of that was my host family were a pretty young Japanese couple, maybe in like their mid 30s at the time. And when I was, we were introduced to each other for the program, it was very much excitement on their part, because they grew up in a time when the entirety of American TV were Black people. It was hip hop, it was basketball, it was, the cars and the clothes and everything. So my host father actually told me, he's like, yeah, for the longest time, I thought America was 100% Black. So I was like, well, that's a new experience. And so they were super excited. They were as excited to meet me, I think, as I was to meet them. It was pretty great.
Okay. Well, yeah, I think a lot of people also like sometimes can struggle with their host family. So that seems like you had a very welcoming and amazing experience. uh, I don't know, Rohan or Russel, if you wanted to add on or chip into some things that surprised you or challenged you while you were abroad as well, or you had any similar experiences with your host families.
Sure, I can jump in. So coming in, I was definitely wary of like how I would be received, especially being like coming into a school, and like I'm sure I was thinking like the school is probably promoted, like, oh, we've got an American teacher coming, and I assumed that the school was probably expecting a white person or somebody who looks like your typical, whatever that means, American. I ended up in actually a pretty great situation. So I was the third Fulbrighter in a row who had worked in this school, and the previous had been white. So maybe I got a good experience because they had their white experience or whatever it may be. But I was actually like really warmly received by both the staff and the students. And I will never forget, like I remember during like my first week of classes, I like had all of the kids, and mind you, I had like a total of like over 500 kids because classrooms in India can be massive. But I had all the kids like write out, like a few things that they wanted to learn. And one of the questions I asked was, what's something you're excited about? And one of them actually wrote like, I'm excited that Sir is Indian. And I was like, wow, okay. That's like, again, like not something I originally expected. And same with the staff, like the schools paired me up with a teacher who was like supposed to be my main kind of facilitator, guide, whatever. She like took me in like family, honestly, like ended up traveling with her and spending a lot of time with her family. I didn't stay with the host family, but she was the closest thing that I had to that. And even like other teachers of the school took me in, I think, in a lot more warmth than they would have had I not been Indian. And there were like some slights from like the previous Fulbrighters that they were still talking about. So like, I guess one of the guys, like, that he was offered food and didn't like it and like threw it away in front of everybody, and they like were still talking about this like 2 years later. And I will, like, there's like two foods in the world that I don't like, so I ate all the food very happily, and that kind of warmed me to all of their hearts as well. Yeah, so I mean, yeah, those are kind of how I experienced kind of coming into the community.
Oh, wow, I can't imagine throwing food. That's like a big no-no. Like, yeah, everyone's like, yeah, no. Russel, I saw you kind of like shaking your head. Did you have like a similar kind of experience during your ETA as well?
Yeah, I mean, I also, so with my Gilman, when I was a Gilman in scholar in Berlin. I also lived with the host family, and I was their 11th student that they had. So they were very well experienced with exchange students, which was really nice. But I was, I think, their first student of color, so that was really interesting. But they're incredibly welcoming. So my host dad in Berlin is like or is not retired, but was a journalist for like a German network. And so he's very well traveled and just has really interesting stories, and just is always so curious and was genuinely interested in sort of learning about me. So coming into that experience was also very smooth. And I did live in sort of this American bubble as a Gilman scholar. However, I think with the Fulbright program, just by nature, it's more hands-off, right? So definitely had me sort of finding my own way. So no longer did I have like the program holding my hand every step of the way through the bureaucratic process of, applying for a residency permit and, doing all of those things. So it like things like that sort of made it a little bit more challenging. But that nevertheless, it was still, the museum that I was working with, the students and the teachers that I was working with at the schools as well, similar experiences as Rohan. And I think that one thing that allowed me to really connect with my students was the fact that even though I don't have any students who identify as Latino or Hispanic, many of them have shared with me that they can very much personally relate to a lot of the experiences that I've shared about myself and my family. So my parents, for instance, are Mexican immigrants living in Southern California who still don't speak any English. And so my first language growing up was Spanish alongside with English. So sort of navigating that, my experience navigating that identity is something I've shared very extensively with my classroom. And so a lot of my students who are first generation students also here in Austria are able to identify and connect. So that's something really special, even though we don't identify the same way, there's still so much for us to connect with. So.
Yeah. No, I think that's really true. That kind of perspective is really important, especially for kids that are around their formative years and trying to figure out the world around them. So it's great to hear you and Rohan had really welcoming experiences with your students. So I just wanted to also kind of touch, and you each have kind of shared some things where you've experienced and been stuck in a scenario that wasn't maybe as welcoming. But have there any been specific instances, and maybe Russel, you can kind of start us off with examples of microaggressions that you may have encountered during your study abroad, being whether in Berlin or Austria, and kind of what did you do in that scenario? How did you navigate that?
Yeah, things that come to mind are both things I've personally experienced, but also even heard and witnessed at schools, like microaggressions, for instance, that I've seen colleagues, not just at the school, but even at the museum where I worked at, just that I've heard colleagues sort of mention about students or other, colleagues and so on. So I think personally, just to be brief, one thing is, for instance, whoa, so sorry about that. So I think one thing that comes to mind first is what comments are often seen as they don't mean anything to whoever said this. It's things like, oh, you don't get tan, right? Or you can't get any tan. So you can spend as much time as you want under the sun. And in the summers when everybody in Austria is sunbathing at the lake and stuff, and just things like that. From being called, being coined the term exotic a few times, definitely. Right. So just these sort of verbal statements that are extremely harmful, can be extremely harmful, but are often not perceived the same way here. The fact that the term exotic is still taught in a lot of English language curriculum in schools, And so also sort of navigating some of that, microaggressive language too, as an educator in the classroom, has been one of my ways to sort of address this. So even though I might not be able to correct, everyone who sort of says these things, but I think I take it upon myself to make it clear in the classroom, at least with the students that I'm working with. And then there's also, of course, like I mentioned bureaucracy earlier. There's one example where, so my partner and I moved in together, and we have to register our address. And so one example is that we both sent in our registration at the very same time. However, with me, they emailed me asking for more information that was never sort of asked for, right? So things also appear in sort of that way too, or have appeared in that manner as well.
Okay. Yeah, I don't know if Amber, Rohan, if you guys have had similar experiences in Japan or India. Amber, it looks like you were also like kind of shaking your head throughout when Russel was speaking.
Sorry, yeah, I was really just shaking my head because I mean, I feel like we can all relate to what Russel was saying. I will say, particularly for Japan, they're a much more like outwardly polite type of people, so they're not going to make these kind of like verbal microaggressions, nor would they think they are actual microaggressions, because it's just, I don't even know if that word exists in the Japanese language, quite honestly. But I will say, like, there have been experiences, like I've had a few, like the time I mentioned on the bus, and there's a time in South Korea where something similar happened, where like my other Black female friend and I got into the shared kind of spa area, and a lady got out. Both of those instances are like, for me, I'm just like, I have more space. Like, that doesn't really bother me, right? Like, okay, great, you're gone, we can spread out. There was one, I mean, that's kind of how I look at it. There was one instance really in Japan that really did kind of stand out to me, that surprised me as well. And again, this is something that only ever happened to me once in Japan. I was out shopping, just a free day after my internship one day, and I went to a store, and it was the first time I've ever been overseas. Well, probably overseas at that time, probably the first time overseas this has happened, where one of the people in the shop actually followed me around the store. And I noticed it, and I was surprised, because I was like, wow, this made it over here from America. Like, you know what I mean? Like, it's just something that surprised me a lot. And it's something I had to think about after the fact, like, interesting. And I mean, the way I really handled that was, I mean, I just didn't buy anything from that store. I just left. Like, if you think I'm stealing, then I'm not going to spend my money here.
Yeah, no, for sure. And this is obviously like this is something that everyone has and on the panel can like relate to as well. So one of the things also that we want to share with our audience and everyone is like, how do you navigate this? Like, are there tools and resources that we can use? And I know Rohan, you've kind of spoken on this, and had experience in this. So what tools and resources, like from Fulbright or exchange programs that you've done or created, maybe would have been helpful for you prior to going abroad, or what is out there that you know of?
Yeah, well, I mean, when we talked about this question, like the thing that really came to mind was just like the lack of preparation that I felt. So when I went to my like pre-departure orientation, all of the alumni representatives who were there were white. And so the experiences that they were talking about were like very much from the lens of like a white person coming to India, or I mean, it was not just India at the orientation, but anyway, coming to these countries and how they're received. And I was like by far definitely not the only person of color, and also not the only person of Indian origin who was part of the group going. And even at the time of the orientation, like me and the other folks of color were like, like a lot of the stuff that they're sharing, like we know from time in India is not going to apply to us. And so it's like some of that is not really helpful. I made that feedback loud and clear, and they actually asked me to be an alumni speaker the next year. So I think at least they heard that, which was good. But yeah, I mean, it sort of goes along with the microaggression and thinking about things. I think one thing that is important to like kind of be prepared for is, so some things like what was shared are obviously that they're wrong. They're microaggressive. They're rooted in racist beliefs, and like that is what it is. but there's also like some legitimate just like ignorance that you'll experience from, and that is rooted in like a lack of access, you know, where like a kid or, you know, someone you're interacting with genuinely may never have been exposed to this. They may not have been taught about the hurtfulness of the language they're using. They may not have been have ever, you know, met someone who is of, you know, a certain race or whatnot. So the questions and the things they say are not meant to be hurtful. And I think like, again, it's hard for me to talk specifically about my own experience, just because like obviously I present as Indian, but I know like especially hearing from some of my other Fulbrighters and like some of the things that would really upset them that were said. So like, for example, in India, it's a lot less. There's a lot less guarding around people commenting on your weight. Like they will just come out and say, like, if they think you've gained weight, if they think you're overweight, like it's not something that people really hold back on.
Very Asian.
And yeah.
Yeah.
And so like I know that like for some of the people I did it with, it was really hurtful when they heard that kind of stuff from people at their school. And like one of the women who I was doing with told me, yeah, she was like, yep, I just stormed out of the staff room and like told them they were being rude. And I thought about it, I'm like, you know, like it's legitimate. You have to have the reaction that you have, and like you can't be expected to like hold back, but also like you may have now damaged the potential relationship that you can have with the people, because these are like the teachers that she's seeing every day, right? It's not like a random occurrence. So again, like I don't want it to come off as me saying that like you need to kind of let things go, because it's important to have the conversations and to, you know, take those opportunities to educate people as best you can, because they may not have another chance to talk to someone with your own experience. But it's also important to try in the moment to identify the intent of what people are saying. Again, with the caveat that if you ever feel unsafe or threatened or anything like that, then like that is obviously a different story and something where you need to worry about your own safety first.
Yeah. No, I think the lack of tools is something also that I noticed that also came up in the Fulbright orientation for a lot of people of color that came to Malaysia as well. And this perception that the teachers and Americans that were supposed to come were supposed to be this white kind of figure that they were expecting. So anything outside of that was like, oh, kind of a disappointment in a way. In some instances, though, it sounds like you had like a very welcoming and amazing experience. But I don't know if anyone else kind of wanted to touch on what tools or resources would have been helpful for you prior to your study abroad experiences, or what can be improved, or what you would have wanted, really.
I can jump in. So I think for me, I'm thinking back to my pre-departure sort of seminars and workshops, and one thing that was never really covered was, you know, mental health resources. I think there's always sort of like these emergency packets, like or even you know, embassies will have on their websites like suggested English speaking doctors, but when it comes to, you know, mental health specialists, for, you know, therapy and things like that, like those are resources that are, you know, seldom found and sort of included in these sort of pre-departure, you know, sort of, I'm getting tired, packets to prepare you to, yeah, you know what I mean, workshops, sorry.
Yeah.
Like, and so for me, and one thing too that I remember, I was part of this sort of Slack group for recently accepted Fulbright, like incoming Fulbrighters. And I remember there was like a conversation about like this medical form that you need to fill out before you go abroad on your Fulbright, where you have to sort of, it's like a medical clearance form. And some people were having some anxiety about the section about like mental health. And I just feel like that came from a lot of, like, there wasn't much clarity in terms of like, what exactly are they wanting to know about our mental health? Like, at what point would this put our grant at risk? Like, how much should I, you know, sort of share and so on. So I think there's still much to be done about that. And I think especially for BIPOC who are being placed in these situations, maybe it's the first time that they're, I don't know, feeling like the only, like what I felt at the beginning is like the only brown person in the room. It takes a big mental toll. And so looking for circles and for support, basically, I think those, even within alumni groups, I think those are just resources that haven't really been developed yet for many programs and many, in many ways. So I would say that. Sorry for my rambling.
No, I think that's a really important aspect that just isn't even talked about. And I think it's that stigma as well. All of us, I remember doing that form as well for like, I think there's a similar one for CLS and talking about it, but it's just not something that you can like freely express in some host countries. And I know definitely for Indonesia, it wasn't anything that anyone would ever ask me. So yeah, these are important things I think that to provide resources, but also kind of finding avenues to share our concerns as well. So kind of moving away from a lot of whether the adverse kind of side of study abroad, I wanted to kind of highlight, like Rohan, you had a really good experience like being in your host school. And I'm sure actually hearing from all of you, you guys had an overwhelmingly pretty good experience. But I wanted to see like, how did being a BIPOC add value to your experience and those around you? And you've kind of touched upon this, so I just wanted to hear just a little bit more. And maybe Amber, you can kind of start us off. Obviously you and your host family, it seems like you were best buds, so you guys.
Yeah. I'll have them on my phone just in case I feel like, just in case I mess with them. I haven't messed them in way too long. But actually specifically to this question, one thing that I really believe added value to like for me and for other people who I was around. So for Boren, which I'm sure most people know, but it's kind of similar to Fulbright in that you're very solo, like you kind of create the program you want. So all the people who I was doing language programs with were from different other countries who all just happened to be at the same language school. So we all just met there, the other kind of English speakers or people trying to learn Japanese, all generally around the same age. And when I was there in 2014, it was around the same time that Black Lives Matter became international. It was right after Eric Garner was killed. And I can't even remember how I found out about it, but I found out that there was going to be a Black Lives Matter protest in Tokyo and was organized by a lot of Black expats, basically. And I found out about it, and another friend of mine who was Japanese American who was in Japan at the time, she found out about it too, and we talked about it, and we both went. And so I actually asked my language school like for a poster board and for a marker. Like they didn't know why, but like I asked for it, right? And I created a little protest poster, and I went with her. And I think that was really, I don't know, I think having that experience in Japan, first of all, it was amazing for me knowing that was even an option over there, right? But I also think it helped the people who were around me because there were news cameras there. I think that was probably the first time a Black Lives Matter protest happened in Japan. And afterwards, one of the folks who worked at the language school I was attending, the next day, he told me that he saw it on the news and he saw that was why I needed the poster board. And so like just bringing that kind of light, like that understanding and having them see this different kind of thing, like I really think that added value to everybody's experience.
How did they react? Were it like started the conversation, or they were just like, oh?
It was probably a little bit like, oh, there's two people who like we actually talked about it, like about why the protest was happening, things like that. And I mean, there was actually it was a Japanese news reporter who interviewed me and my friend, both of us, about the protest and about everything and why we were there. So I mean, I think it was definitely just like a start of something, right? Hey, this is not just something that is important in America. It's important internationally.
Yeah. Thank you so much. Yeah, I can imagine that must have been, was it crowded? I'm like, I can't imagine protests in Japan. In Singapore, it's illegal to protest, so not happening.
Yeah, I know. Don't do that. It wasn't that crowded. It was maybe, I don't know, maybe like 50 to 100 people. It wasn't like a large.
Oh, that's still like pretty good actually. don't know, Rohan, Russel, if you guys kind of want to add like how being like, I know Rohan, you especially like you feel very strongly about how being of Indian origin, right? It kind of helped your experience a lot. You want to just add a little bit more?
Yeah, for sure. I mean,
Quickly.
like that year was it was just like it was everything I needed at that point in my life just to like have that experience from so many angles, right? Like I had visited India growing up as a kid, visiting family and stuff. But like on all of those trips, it was I just always felt like, oh, you're the American cousin. We gotta like hold your hand to everything. We gotta make sure you don't drink the water. We gotta make sure, and so like to be able to like do that year on my own, learn some Hindi, like navigate by myself, like it just felt great, like to kind of like have that experience. And even like in my interactions with some of like people at my school or whoever it may be. So I mean, it's pretty ubiquitous in amongst Indians that like trying to get to a Western country is like the ultimate goal. Like like the after effects of colonialism are very real, right? And so for a lot of them, like hearing that like I was born in the U.S., grew up there, educated there, everything, but like I wanted to come back to India and I wanted to have that experience there and like learn from them while I was there. I think that was just like I don't know, it just was a positive thing to have happen and to have it just kind of flipped it in a way. And I think because of that, like once I established that I'm really here to learn everything I possibly can and like experience everything I possibly can, that's when like the warmth just like poured out from everybody, like invitations to more dinners than I could attend, and like just like all of the men teachers at the school during exams had this like cricket tournament, and so like I was invited to like come in and play cricket every day, and then you eat a big meal obviously because food is everything. So it was, I mean, like I said, it was just like everything I needed in that year, and I genuinely remember like coming back to DC afterwards and like having like not constant, but like having moments where I'm like, dang, it's kind of annoying to go back to like now being the only brown guy in a room and like having to explain basics about Indian culture to people as opposed to like the year that I had here. So
yeah. And I think something you said is like really important. I also faced this when I went to Indonesia and was even like working in Malaysia, Indonesia, is that they'd be like, oh, but you're American. Why would you want to move back here? As if the making it in America is like the ultimate like vision, which I understand the idea, but I think but it also like gives value to the people around you, right? To show that yeah, your country is phenomenal. Our country is phenomenal too. Like it's not just like the American Hollywood that you're seeing. So I think that's important. I think that's something I've also like experienced within communities that I've been in Indonesia, just kind of the shock, like, you want to come here? Like, oh. So I can definitely relate. Russel, I also saw you kind of like shaking your head along. Do you want to add something
I
else?
mean, kind of, I don't know, maybe an inverted experience. I don't know if that's the appropriate word, but for me, a lot of the questions that I got from both from professors, peers at home, and also in my host country when I did my Gilman scholarship in Berlin was like, why Germany, right? Like if you speak Spanish, you have, you identify as a Chicana and everything. Like, why did you choose to go to Germany as opposed to Spain or somewhere in South America? And I think for a while at the beginning, I reflected on that question a lot, and I'll even asked myself like, yeah, why did I? And like, even though I was studying art history and specifically about sort of German art history, Christian art, and so on. But I think over time, it just, after my first experience abroad, sort of independent experience abroad in Berlin, that's when I really started to, I mean, that was really my first time of independence. I mean, I grew up again in this bubble, but also quite sheltered. I mean, I am the youngest child. My parents are very strict, and they also have very high intense double standards. So being like the youngest daughter, right? I didn't really do anything on my own, and I wasn't allowed to sleep over at my friend's house. I'm sure maybe some fellow Mexican household
Yeah.
relate. And so this really was for me sort of my time to really explore. And so after that, not only like I felt a lot more confident in justifying my my own decisions too for why and my decisions for doing things. It's like I didn't feel like I owed anyone an explanation, or really a thorough explanation of like why I am choosing to go to a country to study, the things that interest me, as opposed to, going to study to Mexico just because I am, Mexican American. Like that alone doesn't warrant me, having to choose, one over the other. And so for me, that was a lot of, at first conflicted, but over time, especially after my experience abroad, that sort of solidified.
Yeah, thanks so much. I think that's coming from that kind of background and then moving is just I'm also the youngest of 6 with 5 older brothers, so I can relate very heavily. Yeah, in an Asian household. So I don't know if anyone else just wants to add, or if there are any questions from the attendees. I want to leave some time. But I'll ask, if there are no questions, I'll just ask one last question to our panelists as we're closing off. So basically, just wanted to ask you guys in a few words, like, how did your experience as a BIPOC abroad shape you after your program, and like where you are today? So Amber, can you start us off?
Sure. Really, I think being BIPOC abroad, it really just, I don't know, it makes me want to travel more, like to see more parts of the world, right? Like I had traveled a few places before then, but after then it's kind of like I continue to travel many different places, most places where Black people are not the majority, where Americans are not the majority. And it's just like comparing all these different experiences, comparing how people react to you, how they treat you. Is your Americanism, is your Americanness more important than your Blackness? Is it, is this thing more important than that thing in terms of how people relate to you? It's just very interesting to me personally. It's not something I'm doing anything with. It's just, just little things that I notice. But it also kind of made me want to do international relations more, to travel more, just so people can see these different faces of what American is. So they're not just expecting a white teacher to come in their door, right? And like as a side note, it's really fun when like there is an Asian person who thinks you can't speak a language, but that your Asian appearing friend can. And so they ask the question to her, but she can't answer because she can't speak the language, but you can. Like, that's just exciting. Like, it's just a fun experience to be able to have. So I highly recommend like travel abroad and like have these little fun experiences like that. It'll stick with you.
Yeah, that happens quite often. And I'm sure like Russel and Rohan, you guys also have this happening. Do you just want to have some final points, Rohan, maybe?
Sure. I mean, like I said, like it was a hugely formative experience. I think it was kind of I won't say culmination because it's a lifelong process, but like as a child of immigrants, you kind of go through a lot of different phases growing up in the U.S. where at certain points you celebrate your culture, at other points you want to push it away, and like having my own. I think like it can be difficult being identified like so commonly identified to a country that you may not feel that connected to. So like even growing up, if yes, I had gone to India, but like I grew up in the US, I felt American, but like there's no space in the US where my Indian identity doesn't come up. But now the fact that like I have my own experience and connection with India, like it makes that a lot easier then to kind of when people bring up anything related to me being Indian American, I can always be like, let me tell you about this amazing year that I had in India. That meant a lot to me, and like it's like little things like so like even like I grew up kind of accepting that my name would always be a little bit mispronounced. The correct pronunciation is Rohan. Most people say Rohan. I'm not like militant about correcting people, but I refuse to like mispronounce my own name, which like wasn't the case before going to India. And I guess lastly, on a very just real note, I met my wife during my Fulbright, so that connection will always be there from that time.
Okay. And we're running out of time, so sorry.